Today is Tuesday, October 11th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today, I'm going to talk about a great question, or respond to a great question that has to do with discerning God's will. Discerning God's will. And we all wrestle with this throughout our Christian lives. I can remember back when I was in college and when Dania and I were trying to figure out what we should do with our lives, there were always these confusing decisions that needed to be made, decisions where we felt like there was no black or white direction as to what we should do. And in all honesty, we wish we didn't have to make decisions like that because we simply aren't sure what to do, and we hate the idea of one day regretting making a decision that at the time there was no other way for us to have made the other decision or chosen the other option. So this question of making decisions is very stressful at times, very important, very influential in our lives at times. And we often seek to know, or we wish that we could have God's wisdom to direct us or to reveal to us this answer of what we should do. We have this idea that somehow we should be able to tap into God's infinite knowledge and be able to make this decision with Him simply showing us what to do. It would seem that having a relationship with God would make such help available to us. And yet, when it's time for us to make decisions, we often feel that that help doesn't actually exist. I think about myself as a father, and if my children ever came to me in a situation in their life and said, "Dad, I need your help making a decision," I would always be eager to help them make a decision, but there's a catch in all of this decision making. There's a reason why no one can really help us make decisions. And it's because of our will. Ultimately, the best decision is going to depend upon what we want to do. My grandfather was one of the most important people in my life. And he was often with me when I had difficult decisions to make, and he would always joke around and say, "Take my advice and do what you think is best." And when I was a kid, I thought that was funny, just sort of some dopey saying. But now that I think about things, I realize that there actually is wisdom in that simple little saying, "Take my advice and do what you think is best." So I think what makes giving others advice difficult is that we have to make decisions in our own lives that we actually desire and think is best. And the reason why is because it's ultimately going to be for us to pay the price of those decisions. We're motivated by the prospect of the reward for different decisions, but the work, the sacrifice, the time, the difficulties, the failures, the costs, on and on, ultimately, those are going to be prices that we have to pay, and therefore we have to be careful to make decisions that we will, because we're going to be the ones who have to do the work, who pay the price, and so on. So there is a reason why this advice to do what you think is best is actually the best advice. The problem, again, is that we often feel like our will isn't committed to one or the other option. I remember when Dania and I were younger, our lives were always blessed. We always felt like our life was blessed and was abounding with good things. And we used to laugh because the stress in our life was always between good things. We had good options, and we couldn't pick one, like choosing which flavor of ice cream you want to eat. These decisions that we have can be stressful because we want to do what's best. We want to do what will bring us the greatest happiness. And at the time when these decisions need to be made, we simply don't know what to do. We don't know which decision will turn out the best. And it can be stressful, especially when we have to let something go or burn a bridge that we didn't have to burn, but we chose to burn in some decision we made. And we've all done this many times. I'm sure you can think of a dozen decisions that you made where you had to let something go that was valuable in order to move on to something else. And that letting go is one of the reasons these decisions are difficult. So anyway, as Christians, we think to ourselves, I want God, who knows all things, to show me what I should do. I want God to direct me to the right choice, because He knows all things, and I don't want Him to sit in heaven and laugh at me when I walk off the cliff. I want Him to help me so I don't walk off the cliff. I really don't want to go through a 10-year period of regret and punishment. I would like to avoid that by having God simply say, go left. I want God to direct me in my life and help me to make decisions so that I can enjoy a prosperous, trouble-free life without any regrets. And I think that that's a reasonable request as a Christian to ask of God to grant me such direction. And when we look to the Scriptures, we find what appear to be directions to do exactly that. In Proverbs chapter 3, we read, do not lean upon your own understanding. Do not rely on your own understanding. Other Bible translations translate understanding as prudence. Do not rely on your own prudence. But the alternative is to trust in the Lord. And it goes on to say, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. Well, that seems to teach pretty clearly that I can expect God to, quote-unquote, direct my path. That's exactly what I'm looking for. I would like God to direct my path. And so we take that verse and we put it on the bulletin board and we say, there's a good rule for my life. Do not trust in your own understanding, or do not lean upon your own understanding, but trust in the Lord. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. That's what I'm going to do. And so we stand up and we say a prayer like, Lord, I have this decision to make and I don't know what to choose. I pray that you would direct my path. I pray that you would guide me in this decision, guide me to the right answer, so that I can enjoy a life that's guided by your wisdom and not my own limited understanding. Amen. And then we wait for we know not what. We don't know how God would actually do that. We start looking around for signs of some kind. And if we're honest, we get pretty ridiculous with this sometimes. We'd probably be embarrassed to admit the kinds of things we look for, or promises, secret promises we make to God, or efforts we make to interpret any random thing that happens in our life. But what we find is that even in this case, we're left wandering in uncertainty. The proverb sounds nice, but I'm feeling like a ship lost at sea, just sort of being blown back and forth by every changing wind. And I know that the scriptures teach that that's not how a Christian should live. And really, it's not possible to live like that, because these decisions have to be made day by day by day. There was one preacher when I was in college who was talking on this subject, and he said to us college kids, he said, you can't just hoist up the sails and let the wind blow you wherever it will. Because a lot of younger Christians have this idea that, well, I just want to follow God's will. I just want to do what God's will is for my life. I just want to, and it's just sort of this shallow spiritual talk, as if we're a sailboat with a sail that just follows the wind. But we know it doesn't work like that. If it did, there'd be no reason for prudence. There'd be no need for study, or it would be impossible to ever work. I was just in a tutoring session with a 17-year-old student, and the student is struggling with motivation because he doesn't have any clear goals. And you can just see that Christian students often struggle to set a goal because they feel like it's somehow arrogant or presumptuous to say, I want to go achieve this goal, and I want to zero in all of my attention and energy and resources on this goal, and I want to work for it until I attain it. Many Christians feel uncomfortable thinking like that, talking like that, acting like that, because they're always concerned that they might not do God's will. And so we can see that this feeling that we need to do something, combined with this self-doubting that we're not sure what it is that we should seek, leaves us in this uncomfortable and unhappy place in life where we're just uncertain. We can't make a resolution. We can't make a decision. We can't roll up our sleeves and work towards a goal. And it seems like people who don't think about God don't have this problem. So what do we do? What's the real solution to all of this? And like I said, as I reflect on this and get into this a little, I don't want it to appear as if I have not and do not struggle with this all the time. It's just a part of the Christian life. It's a difficult part of living the Christian life, but I think it's a good part of the Christian life. It shows that we're being careful. We're not just running recklessly after our will. We're concerned. We want to do God's will. We would rather have less if it meant that God was with us than have something more and lose God for it. So I think it's a good problem that we have, but nevertheless, it's important for us to have at least some help in discerning these things. And the danger of this, as we'll see, is that this talk about following God's call or doing God's will and other religious sentiments like these are often used as an excuse to do what we know is not God's will. So we'll get there in a few minutes. The challenge that we have, let's make this really simple and clear, because there's a simple concept. The simple concept is this: we stand in a place of uncertainty, and we desire to move to a place of certainty. That's the simple problem that we have. That's the challenge. We stand in a place of uncertainty, and we want to move ourselves into a place of certainty. How can we move from what is uncertain to what is certain? And this is actually pretty simple, pretty easy to do. We have to ask ourselves, well, if I'm going to look anywhere for help moving from uncertainty to certainty, which is what we do anytime we deliberate on any decision, we have to look to what is certain. And we have to collect for ourselves as much as we can that is certain, and try to make our decision based on what is certain. And the goal of this decision making is to simply make our decisions in light of as much certain information as we can, so that even if we were to make the wrong decision, we would still know that we made it based on information that we had that was, at the time, certain. And so we have to identify what information we have that is certain, and this can come from many different sources. So we have obvious knowledge or sensual information that may be certain. We may have simple physical knowledge of things that are certain. For example, my wife cannot eat eggs. If she eats eggs, her stomach goes crazy and she feels terrible. For her, avoiding eggs is something certain. Physically, sensually, simple, sensible knowledge. Stay away from the eggs. So if she had a decision between two dinners to choose from, the certainty that eggs make her sick would be one piece of certain information to help guide that decision. That's one example. Simple, certain knowledge about sensible things. That's an easy way to make a decision. You know, I have problems at times with allergies. I can use the certainty of troubles caused by certain triggers of my allergies to guide a decision. Simple, sensible knowledge of what's certain based on experience or study. But then there are higher levels of knowledge. we can see that our experience limits what we can know with certainty. Our own experience may provide us with certain knowledge, or our lack of experience may leave us without any certain knowledge on a certain issue. For example, if an 18-year-old kid needs a car and he's going to the car dealership to buy a new car for the first time and he has no experience buying a new car, we can see that that lack of experience is going to make it very difficult for him to make good decisions. He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know what to expect. He doesn't know what's true, who to listen to, who to trust. He doesn't know because he has no experience. And so he will be stuck in uncertainty because of his lack of experience. And that's why one source of certainty is to seek counsel from someone who is experienced in a certain thing. So he may have a cousin who just recently purchased a new car, and he may go and say, "Hey, Amanda, would it be all right if I ask you a few questions, because I'm going to buy a new car and I've never done it before and I don't know what to do. Could you help me so that I make a good decision?" And Amanda can say, "Oh yeah, I can help you. You know, it was the third time I've bought a new car. Let me give you some advice. First of all," and she could give a list of things to think about and watch out for based on her experience that could help an inexperienced person who's uncertain to make a decision with the certainty of an experienced person. That's the benefit of counsel. Why we seek advice for things that we do before we do them, before we do things that we're inexperienced with. So we can seek counsel, and counsel can be sought in all different kinds of sources. It can be sought from people we know. It can be sought through reading articles or reading books, even reading product reviews. That's what we're doing. We're looking for some certainty that could be gained through the experiences of others. And throughout our lives, gathering a cabinet, as it were, of people that we trust, who have experiences that we consider valuable, and making use of that group of people to seek advice from before decisions are made is part of living a wise life. It's one thing to say, "I don't know what God's will is." It's another thing to say, "I don't have experience in this specific situation." So we have our own experience to draw from. We have the experience of others to draw from. And these provide us with much of the guidance that we need for most of the day-to-day decisions that we have to make. But we know that there are more complicated decisions, big decisions, life decisions. Should I become a monk or should I get married? Should I choose to leave my parents and move to the other side of the country, or should I stay close to home? Should I go to graduate school and take out some student loans to pay the bill, or should I stick with my bachelor's degree and just get to work and maybe study part-time? Big life decisions are not so simple, and we often don't know people who have made the same decisions that we have to make. And so it's difficult to just turn to someone and say, "Hey, Dad, what should I do in this situation based on your experience?" We often find that our parents don't have experience with the big things that we have to decide in life, and we're free to make our decisions as adults in these issues, and they're very complicated decisions. And the reason, again, why we have to make them is because we're going to be the ones who have to pay the costs for these decisions. So what happens when there's no one for us to turn to for advice? This is where we find ourselves lost at sea with uncertainty, and we normally turn at this time to God through some sort of prayer or expectation of direction. And it's a very uncertain situation to be in. It's not comfortable. We don't have rest really in this situation, especially when we know that a deadline may be approaching where this decision has to be made. And we're back in the situation where we have to figure out how to move from uncertainty to certainty. Now, one of the problems in these situations, if we're honest, is that we're simply lazy. So we may have a big decision to make, and it feels like there's just no way to know what to do in this situation. And we're being lazy because if we would sit down and analyze the decision, we can find that it can be broken down into many smaller issues that can be deliberated on simply. And sometimes we're just too lazy to do that. Sometimes it makes us stressed to get into the details. I can testify to this with an example. When I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I was really jumping off a cliff with no parachute. That's how it seemed. I had a bizarre sense of peace when I chose to start the academy, even though I had no money and no prospect of making any money. I just had a sense that it was right and good. I had confidence that I was able to find work and do it well, and in a little bit of time, establish a decent living. But I was really jumping off a cliff. There was no one else I could ask for advice. There was no one I could talk about, and honestly, I had no plan how I would make it work. I just was confident that I could make it work. And I didn't have a plan. And the thought of answering financial questions really frustrated me because I didn't have any answers. I didn't know how or when this or that would be possible, or I didn't know. I had no idea. All I could do was put my head down and work. And I was confident that good things would come if I just worked and got to it. I never looked at the bank account. I never looked at any of the numbers. I never made a business plan. I never got into those details of things because when I would do that, I would get stressed and confused because I had confidence that it would work, but I couldn't explain how or when it was going to work. And so I chose to not do that work of planning or budgeting or anything else. I chose to not do that work and just focus on working as hard as I could until I achieved the goal. In my Dominican formation last year, we learned that Saint Dominic, in a similar kind of way, and I'm not claiming that what I did was holy like Saint Dominic's life, which was a completely different mission, but Saint Dominic undertook this work of founding the Order of Preachers, which was a very, very radical work at the time. And he had to travel all over the place, and he did so by foot. He would walk from city to city, even from country to country, he would walk. And it was said in our formation materials that St. Dominic never had a plan for what to do. He knew what needed to be done. He knew the work that was required for that to be possible, and he just concentrated on doing that work. He never had a plan. He simply knew what work was to be done, and that's what he did. That's, in a way, similar to what I did, and I'm not saying that that's good. I'm just saying that we often don't like to analyze our big decisions because we simply don't know all the answers, and it's stressful to try and give an account for every single step of every detail. Often, these are the kind of questions people ask us. Our parents might pester us with all these practical, detailed questions. Well, how are you going to, and what are you going to, and when are you going to do this, and how are you going to afford insurance, and what are you going to do about your mortgage, and what are you going to do about your, and they get into all of these practical questions, all of which are good questions. And we simply don't have all the answers. And sometimes we don't like to do the work of analyzing a complex decision into all of its constitutive, simpler parts or decisions. We lazily and maybe irresponsibly like to leave it as this big hazy cloud and then just cover it all with some religious sentiment and talk about seeking God's direction. And I think usually, especially as young adults, this is what we're doing. And it comes back to our will. There's something that we want to do. There's something that we want to do. And to be honest, it may be a little bit crazy, but we think we can do it. We're confident that we can do it, and we want to try to do it. And so we're willing to undertake it without analyzing it and answering all the questions, all of the nagging, detailed, prudential questions of how much and when and how and who and where, and we don't know. We don't have all those answers, and we don't want to get into that analytical deliberation of the situation. We just want to do it. We want to take a risk. We want to go for this goal. We want to pursue it, and we sort of want to go after it and just figure out what to do as we do it. There's a time where that kind of decision making is necessary. Yesterday was Columbus Day. I'm sure that there were many times where Christopher Columbus said, I don't know what to do. I don't know how we're going to handle that, but let's just do it. I'm sure that if we can get there, we'll figure out the rest. And you know that we often want to do something, and internally, that makes us willing to deal with uncertainties along the way, and difficulties and complications and setbacks and costs along the way. We're willing to deal with those things as long as we're moving towards this goal that we will, something that we desire. And again, that's why these complicated decisions are often complicated more by our will than by anything pertaining to the decision itself. So what are we really trying to discern? What we're really trying to discern, I think, is there any reason why I cannot or should not pursue this? I think that's what we're really asking. We're really not asking what should I do, because if it was just a simple matter-of-fact decision that we had to make, and our deliberation was simply seeking to know which was the better option, all things being equal, we would analyze the decisions, break them down into all of their parts, analyze all of the parts, and then make a decision based on what could be known for certain, and we'd choose what was best or better of the options. But that's really not the situation. The reality of the situation, I think, in most decisions is that there's an option that we prefer. There's an option that we want to choose. But we're not certain about whether we should choose it. And there's another option that we could also choose, but we really don't want that one. It may even be the better of the two choices based on what can be known with certainty. And what we want to know is, may I pursue the option that I want to pursue? And as a Christian, we're asking, may I pursue this without offending God? That's what we're really asking. We don't have all the answers. We don't have all the practical questions or problems solved. We don't know where all the money is going to come from. We don't have the whole project broken down into all of its tasks and detailed steps. We're willing, though, to take a risk as long as we know we're not offending God if we do so. As long as we know that God will be with us on this adventure, as it were, we're willing to go on the adventure without having all of the questions answered. And I think that there's something virtuous about this disposition. I think part of it has to do with living by faith, wanting to do something great, something noble, not necessarily wanting to always be safe, but being willing to suffer a little, being willing to take a risk, being willing to step out of the line and try something that the people around us have never tried. I think there's something virtuous about this desire to do something different. And what we're really seeking to know behind this smoke screen of spiritual talk that we share with other people, we're trying to discern whether we can do this without offending God. And I can think of a couple good examples that support me in this. If you've ever read Shakespeare's Henry V, and if you haven't read it, rather than read it, I recommend you get a copy of the film version of Henry V that was produced by Kenneth Branagh. Kenneth Branagh actually plays the part of Henry V. It's a great video. I recommend you take a night and watch Kenneth Branagh's Henry V. The story of Henry V relates to the war between England and France, which concluded at the famous Battle of Agincourt, where Henry's English army defeats the French army in a miraculous victory. Early on in the story, King Henry, who's a young Catholic king, he becomes aware of an attempt of the French to seize lands and titles that belong to Henry. But they're seeking to take hold of them because they don't think Henry will do anything about it, because Henry had a reputation as a younger boy of being foolish and prodigal. And so the French are seeking to take advantage of Henry's prodigal reputation, and they're trying to seize lands and titles that are not theirs. And Henry is being encouraged by his counselors in his inner circle to claim these lands and titles and to be willing to war with France if they're not given to him. And Henry, in this situation, doesn't know what to do. He's not certain what he should do, but he knows what he wants to do. Henry is a courageous, noble king. He wants to go and claim these lands and titles, and he's willing to go to war with a much mightier French army because he's a faithful, heroically minded Catholic king. Henry has a decision to make. The option that he desires might not be the prudent option, but it's the option that he wants. And he's confident that with God's help, he can achieve it. And so, in Branagh's film production of the play, the Archbishop of Canterbury, remember these are all Catholics at the time in English history, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I forget there's another religious with him in the film, I forget his identity, but they come at the end to give counsel to King Henry. And the one, I think it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he presents the whole legal situation in this issue to the king with his cabinet there gathered with him in secret. And Henry asks the Archbishop one question after he's finished presenting this whole case to King Henry. And he essentially asks, I don't have this memorized, but he essentially asks, may I go and make this claim with good conscience? That's what Henry wants to know. He basically is admitting, I want to do this. I have a decision to make, yes. We could choose to let them take these lands and just ignore it. But I would like to go and claim these lands. That's the option that I want. And it's risky. And it's maybe a little crazy. But I'm confident that it can be done, and I want to do it. But here's my question. May I do it? May I, with good conscience, pursue this option and not offend God? That's what Henry wants to know. And I think in many of these dilemmas, that's what we actually want to know. We want to know, may I, not can I, but may I do this which I want to do? When I don't have all of the T's crossed, all the I's dotted, I don't have all of the answers figured out, I don't have all of the provisions figured out, but man, I want to do this. I want to go for this. And what I want to know is, may I pursue this with good conscience? That's what we're really seeking to know, I think. When we have these big life decisions, I mean, what are the big life decisions? Aren't they usually one safe option and one wild option that we're excited about? And I don't mean wild in any bad way. I mean, there's options to choose from. And as Christians, we're already looking at only good options. But there may be one option that we lay in bed thinking about, and it gets us excited, and we sort of daydream thinking about it. It's the wild option. It's the heroic option. It's the brave option. It's the option where we feel like we can go act like saints and pursue this great work, this great option, even if we don't have all the questions figured out. And we're asking, may I do this? Lord, can I do this? And if I do this, will you go with me and do this? I think that's really what the issue is. And that's why I think we tend to present it in this sort of vague, fuzzy, spiritual language. Like, I'm just trying to discern God's will. I just want to know, follow the Lord. We couch this reality with this innocent, detached, unbiased talk about whatever God wants, but that's really not what we're saying. I think what we're saying is, I already know what I want to do. I'm trying to see if I can do it with God's blessing, if I can pursue it. I'm willing to take great risks. I'm willing to undergo great hardships. I'm willing to pay great costs, make great sacrifices, if God will go with me. If someone could prove to me that God will not go with me, then I'm not interested. But if God will go with me, then I'm interested. That's the certainty that I think we're usually seeking as Christians. That's the certainty we're seeking. And I think for Protestants, because many of my young adult decisions were made as a Protestant, I think for Protestants this is even more difficult, because Protestant religion comes with much less certainty than Catholic religion. The sacramental life gives us a level of certainty that Protestantism, for all of its talk, really lacks. And Protestants are tormented by this lack of certainty throughout their lives. Many of them don't even know if they're saved, can't even answer that question. But the sacramental nature of Catholicism offers some more certainty than the invisibility of Protestantism. And in Catholicism, I think we have a little more certainty. But this, I think, is the question we're asking. May I, Lord, may I do this? Will you be with me on this path? This more difficult, more uncertain, more risky path, but more desirable path. Will you go with me on this path? Because if you will go with me, then I'll take all of the burdens. I'll take all of the challenges. I'll accept the uncertainty and work through it step by step, whatever it costs, whatever it takes, as long as I know you're with me. That's the decision I had to make in starting the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I looked down this path, moving away from the most comfortable job situation imaginable in my private school teaching position. Easy schedule, easy classes, pleasant work environment, sufficient salary was mine until retirement, most likely. Easy life. But there was this other option that got my heart beating. And what I wanted to know, was there any reason why I couldn't go after this? Or was there something that would make it wrong for me to do so? And this, I think, leads us to the solution. Because what we're asking is not for some experienced prudential guarantee of success. We're not asking for some recommendation of the method for how to bring about this goal. We're not asking for any escape from the difficulties. We're just asking, can I pursue this within God's will? That's what we're asking. The uncertainty is whether I can pursue this thing that I desire to do within God's will. And we may not know enough about God and God's will to make that decision. And it's important that in Romans chapter 12, and I quote this passage all the time, St. Paul says, "Do not be conformed to the image of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may know what is the will of God." So that you may know what is the will of God. That's the purpose of being transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can know God's will. And we know the apostles were no strangers to risky decisions. But knowing God's will is the key to being able to live a courageous life, a truly courageous life. Not what Aristotle calls an audacious or reckless life, which is foolishness, but a truly courageous life. Because a courageous man fears what should be feared to a degree that it should be feared, in a way that it should be feared. He doesn't live without fear. The solution to this, how can we know? How can we know with certainty God's will? We can't know the details of God's will as it applies to the details of practical situations. Like, what specifically should I do? Should I write with a pen or a pencil? God doesn't reveal his will to us in practical details like that. And it really is irrelevant. God reveals to us what our faith asks for, and that is, may I do this or not? God reveals his will to us, but what he reveals is his moral and religious will. God teaches us how to worship him and how to behave morally, to love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And God explains and teaches us how to do that, what the demands of love are in our lives. And so the answer, how can we discern whether a thing is or is not God's will, is by the study and reflection on his commandments. His commandments are the answer to this question. The source of our certainty in these dilemmas in our lives. The source of certainty is God's commandments, because he has already revealed his will to us through his commandments. And his commandments become for us the signs that lead us step by step through the decisions that we have to make. And as I go through these, I know that it's going to upset people, but I think this is the problem that we face and what makes these decisions difficult. The commandments are our guide. The commandments provide us with the certainty that we're seeking, and this is taught explicitly in the scriptures. King David in the Psalms says, "Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path." Your word is the lamp to my feet. Well, what is a lamp to our feet? We live out in the country. Our driveway at night, we have a long driveway, 1,000, 1,500 foot long driveway. If you go out in our driveway at night, it is pitch black. It's impossible to walk down the driveway without stumbling. We need a lamp or a light to allow us to walk through the driveway at night because of all of the stumbling blocks along the way. David says, "Your word is the lamp to my feet," speaking allegorically. All of the difficult decisions, all of the difficult issues, all of the stumbling blocks are impossible for us to navigate through in the dark based on our own understanding, which is so limited. And this ties back to the proverb. But God's word is a lamp that guides us through these things, around these things, and so on. God's word. And remember, when David wrote the Psalms, God's word was the law. The law of Moses was God's word to David. So literally, David was saying, "Your law is the lamp to my feet and the light to my path." God's commandments answer those questions. Do not lean on your own understanding, which is darkness, but trust in the Lord. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. You see, when we put these passages together, it becomes clear what's meant there. It's not this kind of wishy-washy, "Lord, I acknowledge you, please direct." No, it's not that phony, counterfeit mysticism. That proverb is telling us to go to the law where God has revealed to us His will and use the law to make these decisions. That's what we're seeking anyway. We seek to know if we can do this thing that we desire to do within the bounds of God's will. So we go to the commandments. And of course, the next question is, do you know the commandments? Do we study the commandments? Are we studying and working to have our minds filled with God's commandments so that we can make these decisions with certainty? Think about this. The Old Testament law is given to us in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. The book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, is an exposition of the law. This is the point of the law. This is the point of the book of Sirach, to give us this wisdom, to be a lamp for our feet and a light for our path, to allow us to know if we may do what we desire to do within God's will. Anything along the path that requires us to disobey God's will, we can know with certainty that we're not to do that. God will guide us, not by some magic fairy dust Tinkerbell that leads us through the forest. God directs us through our life by the commandments which He has revealed in black and white in the sacred scriptures. So, for example, we're working through college and we're really stuck. We've got a calculus exam on Tuesday and we don't have the opportunity to study for that exam. So we have two options. We can go and take that exam and fail that exam. or we can cheat on that exam. We can prepare a cheat sheet, hide it in our sock, or whatever method we choose to use, and we can cheat to get a decent grade on that calculus exam and move on to the next step. What should we do? What's God's will? God's will is to get an F. If those are the two options, then God's will would be in that situation to get an F on that calculus exam. Not to lie, not to cheat, not to break the rules, not to act immorally, but to accept the truth. And what happens when we do this? What happens when we actually trust in the Lord and do not lean on our own understanding? What actually happens is that the results are rarely ever what we think they're going to be. We always expect the worst, and we struggle to make a decision, and we often find that what actually happens is not what we expected, or the outcome doesn't work out the way that we thought it would, and something else happens. And that's the only way for us to discern God's will and move forward step by step, day by day, with certainty that we are walking with God. The lamp to our feet is the law that God has revealed, His commandments. And we'll often find that things don't work out as we think they will. We'll often find that the devil is tempting us to fear outcomes that are worse than they will actually be. I dealt with this last semester with my son Jonathan, who was working through a college math course that he hated, and he was tempted to cheat because he just wanted to get done with it. His major has nothing to do with math. His career has nothing to do with math. And he was tempted to just cheat his way through this math class just to get it done so he can move on with his life. And I told him to not cheat because what you think is going to happen is not going to happen. And what happened was he just went on through this course, and I don't know if he ever cheated or not, I'm not saying that, but he went on through this course, and at the end of the course, lo and behold, the teacher chooses to curve the grades, and it's not so bad. And the kids who cheated acted contrary to God's will, and they didn't need to. And often that's the case. We often disobey God's law, and we find in the end that we didn't need to. We often find that if we follow God's law in our decision making, doors open to us and situations arise that we didn't know existed. This happened when I was a young man in college and this happened to me all the time. I would have people telling me, "Oh, you have to do this, you can't do that, you have to do this, you need to do this." And I would be stressed, and I'd be tempted to take all kinds of bad advice. Just do this, just cut this corner, just break this rule, don't worry about that. And I found that when I simply entrusted everything to God and obeyed His law, that opportunities opened for me that others didn't know existed or didn't have. And they were made known to me, and they were made available to me because I trusted. And I could give hours of examples of these situations. Seriously, hours. And this has continued through my whole life. I've never worried about what others say. I've never worried about others' anxieties, others' stress. My wife will testify that I keep calm and I let God's commandments direct my decisions, and I trust. This is why I even teach the classical liberal arts, because when I look at education, I trusted the saints. I said, look, if St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and St. Ignatius of Loyola all said do this, just because we don't understand where this is going to lead doesn't mean that we should ignore all their counsel and do what everyone else is doing. I'm going to trust the saints and do what they said to do, and we'll see where it goes. Well, my 3 oldest kids are all in college with no problem, so all of the talk is baloney. And now, as the academy continues to develop and we restore the classical liberal arts, we're starting now to see where this is going. And no one could envision it. The fake classical education movement, people couldn't envision it. They chose the shortcuts, and they get what they deserve. The same results that other non-Catholic schools achieve. But they're not going to achieve what we're going to achieve, because they don't even know that these doors are open. How many people told Christians that they need their homeschool program to be accredited? I was the one who showed everyone that that's false. That no one is telling you you have to use an accredited homeschool program. That's the kind of worldly anxiety that fills the minds of most people. And what it means to not lean on your own understanding, but to trust in the Lord, is to not listen to these things. To not listen to all these worldly anxieties, to not worry about the people who are going to demand, well, how are you going to do this, and how are you going to provide for this? We already know that we need to live by faith. The just live by faith. They don't have all the answers, but they're certain, and the reason why they're certain is because they're walking in obedience to God's law. And walking in obedience to God's law reveals solutions and options to us that the disobedient people don't know about, don't get to experience. How did Moses know that God would part the Red Sea? He learned that God would part the Red Sea by obedience. Obedience led Moses to experience the parting of the Red Sea. How did the disciples know that Jesus would feed 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread and some fish? They learned by trust. They learned by trusting. How did Peter know that when he was put in prison, an angel would deliver him from the prison in the middle of the night? He didn't know that. He didn't know how the ministry would work itself out. He learned about the angel coming and saving him by obedience and trust. How did Abraham know that he would become the great patriarch of the Jewish religion? How did he know? He didn't know that. He was told what to do and he obeyed. How did Noah know that a flood would come and that he would be saved by that flood, or from that flood, by the ark? He obeyed God's commandments. And what we see in the lives of all of the saints, when we read about their miracles, when we read about all of the amazing things they did, those miraculous, heroic, amazing things that they did were done and experienced because they were walking in the path that they were directed to by God's commandments. It's very simple. It's very simple. The path that they walked in was the path of obedience. The miracles came not to people who prayed for miracles. The miracles came to people who were seeking to be obedient to God's will, and who obedience led to solutions that they could never have imagined. The source of the certainty in our lives is not through financial analysis of every different project. It's not through the study of history to find out what men did before. It's not through seeking out advice in every situation from experienced men, although these things all have their place, and I think I've made that clear. The source of certainty in these major life decisions that we make as Christians, where we already have our will fixed on one of the options, usually one that's more courageous, more glorious, we could say. The source of certainty for whether we can pursue that course, make that decision, the certainty is found in God's commandments. So we can start with the Old Testament moral law. We can take the Golden Rule. We can look more specifically at the precepts of the church. If the precepts of the church say that you need to attend Mass every Sunday, that's the lamp for your feet. If this option requires you to not attend Masses, then you have no approval from God to pursue that path, because the commandment says, attend Mass on all Sundays and holy days of obligation. That's not a burden in your life. That commandment is a guide and a help in your life. Obedience is where all of the peace, all of the true courage, all of the successes, all of the great achievements, all of the heroic missions comes from. All of the miracles of saints, all of the amazing stories, they come where Christian men are walking in God's commandments. Like Saint, who was it, Aloysius of Gonzaga? Or maybe Dominic Savio, whose motto was death before sin? That's the idea of a life lived with certainty. John Bosco supposedly taught the boys that they could do whatever they want as long as it wasn't sin. That's the same idea, because that's what we do as Christians. We do what we want. We ultimately do what we want, and the difference between an evil person and a virtuous person is that an evil person does what he wants even if it means transgressing God's laws, whereas a virtuous person does what he wants but never transgressing God's law. So what is essential in these decisions is whether or not we obey God's law in all things at all moments. That's what actually matters. The details of decisions we make outside of that are relatively insignificant. If we're honest, we'll know that it doesn't really matter what we choose to do. It really doesn't matter if you become a doctor or a missionary. Nobody cares what you or I do. It doesn't matter. We're not that important. Our life's work is not that significant. Nobody's going to care about the bridge you build or the tunnel you design or anything else. Nobody cares. It's your own life. It's your own business. Everyone's busy minding their own business, dealing with their own story. No one really cares what you do. What matters is whether you obey God's commandments or break them. That's what ultimately matters. That's why Jesus said, what good is it if a man gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Nobody cares about your achievements if the price of those achievements was your own soul, which you lose through willful disobedience. That's what a mortal sin is. a willful transgression of God's commandments. Who cares about your degrees if you sinned? Who cares about your championship trophies if you sinned to get them? Who cares about the deal you made or the client you won if you won the client at the cost of transgression? Who cares? That's not achievement. That's not achievement. You missed the whole point. You failed the whole test. Nobody cares about your temporal achievements. Nobody cares. You failed the actual test, which is obedience. And so I think that's the answer. And we have to learn to speak more intelligently on the subject. Don't give us the cheesy, wishy-washy, breezy spiritual talk. Oh, I'm just seeking to follow God's will. No, just get to it and be honest. What is it that you want to do? You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to start my own study program where I teach and restore the classical liberal arts. Well, how are you? I don't know. I don't know the details. I don't have the whole thing mapped out in detail. I'm willing to go through it with difficulty. My wife is willing to help me. We're willing to work through things. We're willing to sleep on floors and go without date nights and whatever else we have to deal with. We're willing to go through all those things. We really want to do this. This is what we want to do. I don't have all the answers. We don't have to be fake about it and pretend we're so spiritual that we can't speak honestly. We want to do a certain thing. And what we want to know is whether it's within God's will. Other people don't have a right to tell us what we may or may not do. That's between us and God's commandments. And if we're wise in dealing with other people, if someone asks us for advice, what we should really be seeking to do is help them to discern what God's commandments have to say about the decision that they're making. And if we see someone concerned that they walk within God's commandments, we can trust that they're doing okay. They're thinking about the right things. And all the saints we tell our kids about, and all the stories of the patriarchs and prophets and apostles, they were all crazy stories. But there was one thing about all of these men that was not crazy, and it was that they were obedient to God's commandments. That's what made their life not crazy, but in fact made their life more certain and more secure than any of the life of the budgeters living around them who were walking outside of God's commandments. The life of the saints was a secure, peaceful, stable life, even if they didn't have business plans and cash flow forecasts and months of expenses in their savings accounts. They had a peace and a security and a spirit that was able to persevere and overcome difficulties, to carry crosses, to bear with trials and so on, because they knew that what they were doing was within God's will and it was worth sacrificing for. They weren't troubled with questions of conscience and uncertainty. They weren't in depression, dejected, feeling themselves separated from God by sin. They didn't have those problems, which are the real problems. John Bosco couldn't figure out how to pay the bread, how to pay his bill to the baker for all the bread he got for the boys. He didn't know where they would be able to actually live, but all those things worked themselves out. John Bosco knew, however, that what he was doing was good and within God's will, and that's why he was able to persevere. And this is true of all the saints' stories. And this is what we're really seeking when we want to know what it means to follow God. This plan that I have, this desire that I have, this option that I want to know if it's within God's will. And the simple way that we can discern that, once we've discerned that the thing itself is not intrinsically evil but is acceptable, is to simply focus on every decision at every step of the way and make sure we never knowingly or willfully disobey any of God's commandments. And as long as we walk in that way, we can be sure that when we face difficulties, they're difficulties that we should persevere through. We shouldn't sit around wondering, oh, maybe God's against us. Maybe God sent this punishment because he's angry, because we're... No, we won't have those kinds of troubles. We'll know that this is just a trial on this way, walking with God, and we're simply to persevere through it. We're doing good work within God's will, work that we're permitted and encouraged to do, work that saints have done, and so on. And as long as we're honest and staying within God's commandments, we can live with a sense of certainty that it's okay for us to pursue what we want to do, so long as we avoid sin. So I think that's the real issue. That's the real source of the uncertainty. I think the phony spiritual language where everyone tries to make themselves sound like some kind of spirit-led mystic confuses things even more, because I don't think that that's what's really going on. We're simply discerning whether we can pursue what we want to without sinning against God, while walking in his commandments. And the easiest way for us to discern that is to go ahead and begin and simply make sure that at every point of the way we stay within the path of his commandments. And that's why I said before, I think the advice my grandfather gave me, who was not a Christian, by the way, his advice was, take my advice and do what you think is best. That's true as long as we add to it and never disobey any of God's commandments, but rather allow them to be the lamp for your feet and the light for your path, and enjoy the certainty that obedience gives you, even though the path will take you in places that you cannot imagine, because you will only learn of them after you've been obedient. I hope that's helpful. God bless.